Sergeant Tasha Williams stepped into the courthouse with a sense of calm. She was no stranger to authority, having spent years serving in the military. But this was different. Today, she was just another civilian facing a routine traffic violation. Her mind, however, wasn't focused on the fine or the judge who would soon deliver it. Tasha's thoughts were with her upcoming project, a presentation she'd been preparing for weeks on the Army's newest diversity initiatives. These initiatives were her brainchild, the culmination of years of advocating for change in an institution where change often came slowly. The courtroom buzzed with the usual noise as people fidgeted, lawyers whispered, and the bailiff called out names. Tasha tried not to let her mind wander too far, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her work in the Army was more important than any legal fine. It wasn't that she dismissed the significance of the case. It was simply that her focus was always on the larger picture, on fighting for equality, and on making sure the voices of those who were often unheard were finally recognized. "Sergeant Tasha Williams," the clerk called. Tasha straightened her shoulders and stood up, her military posture sharp, as she walked toward the bench. As she approached, she took a moment to glance at the judge sitting at the front. Judge Samuel Harris, in his mid-50s, was known for being meticulous. His reputation as a stern, no-nonsense figure made him someone you didn't want to cross in his courtroom. Tasha had heard of him, but this was the first time they were meeting face-to-face. She had seen men like him before, the kind who took no interest in the individual stories behind cases, focusing only on the letter of the law. "Ms. Williams," Judge Harris began, glancing up from his notes, "you are here for a traffic violation." His voice was steady, but there was an underlying sharpness to it, as though every word was measured. "According to the citation, you were speeding in a residential area. Is that correct?" Tasha nodded, keeping her gaze steady, though she felt a slight tension rise in her chest. Her military background made her an expert in staying composed under pressure, but that didn't mean she was immune to the impact of being judge. "Yes, Your Honor. I was speeding. It was an unintentional error." The judge's eyes narrowed as he assessed her. "Unintentional or not, speeding is a serious matter. The fine will be $200, and you will need to complete a driver's education course within the next 6 months." Tasha's mind raced for a moment, but she nodded. She'd taken full responsibility for the infraction, and though the fine wasn't a concern for her, it felt somewhat out of place. She had spent her life working to create systems that were more just, that allowed for understanding and compassion. And yet here she was, caught in a system that seemed indifferent to her personal context, as if the only thing that mattered was the simple application of the law. As she accepted the decision, she couldn't help but think that Judge Harris didn't know who she was, didn't know the kind of change he was leading within the military, or the lives she had touched with her advocacy. It was a small, almost insignificant interaction, but to her, it felt like a moment that defined the difference between authority and true understanding. Tasha left the courtroom quietly, the sound of the gavel ringing in her ears, but already she was planning her next steps for a much bigger fight. Judge Samuel Harris sat back in his high-backed chair, scanning the paperwork in front of him. His courtroom was a place where order was paramount, and his reputation for dispensing swift, unflinching justice was well established. He believed in fairness above all else, treating everyone the same, regardless of background or status. That was the way the law should be applied, he thought, equally, without emotion or bias. As Tasha Williams had stepped before him just moments earlier, he hadn't thought twice. She was a woman, a civilian, just like any other person who found themselves in front of him for a traffic violation. There was no reason to treat her any differently. She had admitted to speeding in a residential area, and that was enough to make his decision easy. The fine was set, and there was no reason to question it. Judge Harris had seen it all during his years on the bench, cases of all kinds, from petty misdemeanors to the most complex criminal trials. His method was always the same: assess the facts, apply the law, and move on. No exceptions. He believed this approach kept things clear, focused, and above all, fair. He hadn't thought much of Sergeant Tasha Williams when she had entered the courtroom. She was just another name on the docket, another case to handle in a busy day. She had maintained her composure well, and that was notable, but to him, it didn't mean much. She was simply following the legal process, and he was doing his job. There were no personal connections here, no room for assumptions beyond what the case presented. But as Tasha had walked out of the courtroom, her military posture still evident even as she left the room, something lingered in the back of Judge Harris's mind. There was a certain air about her, a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose, that had caught his attention. He'd seen many people come through his courtroom over the years, but there was something different about her. He couldn't quite place it, but it was there, subtle yet unmistakable. The fine was routine, but that feeling he couldn't shake lingered. Perhaps it was the way she'd carried herself, or how she'd seemed unruffled despite the situation. Or perhaps it was simply because, in a sea of faces he saw day in and day out, she stood out to him in a way that he couldn't quite explain. For a moment, Judge Harris found himself wondering who she was beyond the case, what had brought her to his courtroom, what had shaped her into the person standing before him. His curiosity was fleeting but nagging, and he pushed it aside. After all, he had a job to do, and his focus needed to remain on the law. But that sense of curiosity about Sergeant Tasha Williams was not so easily forgotten. Something about her story was waiting to be uncovered. He just didn't know it yet. Back at the Army base, Sergeant Tasha Williams was deep into the work that defined her life. The courtroom experience felt distant now, as she focused her energy on the initiatives she was leading. Initiatives that had the potential to change the entire fabric of the U.S. Army. Her office was filled with stacks of paperwork, reports on the success of her diversity programs, and blueprints for future projects aimed at making the military a more inclusive space. For years, Tasha had fought for soldiers who, like her, often felt invisible. As a black woman rising through the ranks, she knew firsthand the challenges of navigating an institution built on tradition and hierarchy. But she was determined to make a difference, to break barriers not only for herself, but for the countless others who came after her. Her efforts were behind some of the most groundbreaking changes in the Army's policies on diversity and inclusion. Tasha had helped push for new recruitment strategies to ensure that people from all walks of life had access to military service, working with senior leadership to diversify the ranks in meaningful ways. She had been a driving force in establishing mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, offering guidance and support to those who lacked access to the same opportunities as others. And perhaps most significantly, she had helped create leadership training focused on breaking down unconscious biases, making sure that soldiers learned to see each other not as stereotypes, but as people with their own unique experiences. But while these efforts had begun to pay off, evidenced by the growing number of diverse soldiers advancing to leadership positions, there was still much to be done. Tasha had always said that the real work was never finished, that the Army had to keep evolving, had to keep adapting to the changing demographics of the nation. Her projects were far from small tasks. They were a huge undertaking, requiring months, even years of constant negotiation, education, and sometimes resistance. But Tasha thrived in the challenge. She understood that progress didn't come easily, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make lasting change. As she sat in her office, reviewing the impact of the mentorship program, Tasha's phone buzzed with a message from her colleague, Captain Daniel Brooks. "The presentation is set for next week," it read. Tasha smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Her work was getting the attention it deserved, and the upcoming briefing to senior military leaders could make a big difference in how the Army viewed diversity initiatives moving forward. The courtroom incident was already fading in her mind, but it wasn't lost on her that moments like these, ones where authority seemed distant from the work she was doing, were common. Many of the people who enforced laws and policies knew nothing of the changes happening within the walls of the Army. They had no idea that someone like Tasha was quietly revolutionizing the institution from within. She was a soldier first, but her fight for equality was her true mission, one that extended far beyond the limits of the military. And though she didn't realize it yet, her path would soon cross again with the judge, a moment that would force them both to reconsider what they knew about fairness, judgment, and the unseen impact of one person's work. Judge Samuel Harris had seen thousands of cases in his career, each one blending into the next, but something about Sergeant Tasha Williams had left an impression on him. It wasn't a dramatic moment, nor was it particularly profound at the time. But when he dismissed the court for the day and retreated to his chambers, Tasha's name kept echoing in his mind. He was used to following a routine, treating every case with the same detached professionalism. But there had been something about her, her composure, her quiet strength, that stayed with him. The next morning, as he sifted through a pile of paperwork, Judge Harris' phone rang. It was General David Lawson, a retired Army officer and a longtime acquaintance. They had worked together on several projects in the past, including Veterans Affairs, and the general was known for his vast network of contacts within the military. "Samuel," the general's voice crackled through the phone. "I wanted to pass along a name to you. Sergeant Tasha Williams. You probably won't remember her, but she was in your courtroom yesterday. I know her work, and it's impressive. She's been leading some major diversity and inclusion initiatives in the Army." The name hit him like a bolt of lightning. "Wait, Sergeant Williams. The one I find." Harris's voice softened, realizing the connection. "Yes," General Lawson continued. "She's done more for the Army in the last few years than most people realize. Tasha's behind some of the most significant changes to military culture, focusing on improving opportunities for underrepresented groups. I thought you might be interested." Judge Harris sat back, stunned. He had no idea. As a judge, he was used to making decisions based on the law, not on who people were outside of the case at hand. But hearing the general's words made him reconsider his earlier judgment. Could it be that Tasha Williams, the woman he'd seen briefly in his courtroom just the day before, was more than just another case file? Her calm demeanor had been striking, but he never thought to ask why. Now he felt a growing curiosity about her, an urge to understand her better. He quickly pulled up her name online and began to read. What he found was staggering. Tasha Williams had not only been a rising star in the military, but was at the forefront of projects reshaping how the Army handled diversity, equity, and inclusion. She had pioneered programs aimed at creating leadership pipelines for minority soldiers and had advocated for structural changes to ensure that the military was a place where anyone, regardless of race or background, could thrive. Judge Harris couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. He had imposed a fine on someone who had spent her career fighting for equality and fairness, not just in the courts, but within the very institution he had sworn to serve. His earlier judgment felt increasingly out of place as he learned more about her. He had made his decision without knowing the full story, and now he realized that his actions might have been more than just a mistake. They might have been misguided. The more he read about her work, the more Harris felt a deep sense of admiration. But there was still one lingering question. How could someone with such a powerful impact on military culture end up in his courtroom for a simple traffic violation? The answer wasn't clear, but the connection between them, between his role as a judge and her role as a changemaker, was becoming impossible to ignore. As the days passed, Judge Samuel Harris couldn't stop thinking about Sergeant Tasha Williams. Her face, calm and composed in his courtroom, was now etched in his memory, not as a simple defendant, but as a trailblazer in the military. Every time he thought back to the case, his guilt grew. He had seen her only as a name on a docket, another person who had violated a traffic law. But now, in light of what he had learned, he realized how little he had known about the person who had stood before him. The fine, the penalty, the cold transaction of justice, it all seemed so insignificant now compared to the larger work she was doing. How had he not seen it before? It was clear to him that Sergeant Williams was someone who had dedicated her life to serving others, to fighting for fairness in a world that often seemed to ignore those who needed it most. And here he was, imposing a fine, without any sense of her background or her contributions. The realization struck him like a wave. Harris spent the next few days grappling with his thoughts. He was a man of the law, but he also prided himself on being just. He believed in fairness, but fairness didn't just mean following the rules without question. It meant understanding the full context of every situation. And in this case, he had failed to do that. Tasha Williams had been more than a defendant. She was a leader, a change agent. The more he thought about it, the more it felt wrong to have treated her like any other person who had broken a law. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but it also sparked something else, a desire to make things right. If he could learn more about her work, perhaps he could gain some insight into how to better understand the people who came before him in his courtroom. After all, this wasn't just about laws and fines, it was about people. And people, as he was coming to understand, were much more than the cases they brought to court. Judge Harris knew he had to reach out. The question, however, was how. He wasn't used to this kind of self-reflection, nor did he have experience in approaching someone he had previously judged. But there was a part of him that felt a responsibility, not just as a judge, but as a person who had to acknowledge his mistakes. He had to know more about Sergeant Williams. He had to learn about the impact she was making. And most importantly, he had to apologize for his oversight. He sat at his desk, the phone in his hand, hesitating. He wasn't sure what to say or how to begin, but he knew that an apology, even a simple one, might be the first step in bridging the gap between them. Tasha Williams deserved that much, at the very least. With a deep breath, he began typing a letter that would be the beginning of a conversation that neither of them could have anticipated. As he signed the letter, Judge Harris felt a strange sense of relief. He was taking the first step toward correcting an error, and he knew that this would be more than just an apology. It would be an opportunity for both of them to learn something new about justice, fairness, and understanding. Judge Samuel Harris sat back in his chair, staring at the letter he had just written. The words were carefully chosen, the tone sincere, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that accompanied this unfamiliar step. Reaching out to someone he had judged in court was something he had never done before. But this situation felt different, as if the very essence of justice required him to make amends. After all, this wasn't just about the law. It was about understanding the full scope of a person's life and work. And now that he knew more about Tasha Williams, he felt compelled to acknowledge the disparity between the woman he had met in court and the trailblazer he had read about. He signed the letter and sent it off, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. There was no telling how Tasha would react. She had no reason to care about an apology from a judge who had simply done his job, even if he felt it was a mistake. She was a woman of influence, a leader in a field where many didn't even know her name. But there was a part of him that hoped she would understand the genuine desire to learn from his error. Tasha, for her part, was surprised when the letter arrived. She had expected a quick, impersonal resolution to the court case, a fine, a simple payment, and that would be the end of it. But here was a letter from Judge Harris, acknowledging his decision, admitting that he might have missed something important, and expressing his regret. She sat down at her desk, reading the words carefully. She had no reason to expect a letter like this, especially from someone in a position of power. It wasn't just an apology. It was a request to learn more about her. The judge spoke of his desire to understand the work she was doing in the Army, to hear about the challenges and changes she had been a part of. It was an invitation to engage with someone who, until now, had seen her only as a name in a legal proceeding. Tasha was taken aback. She wasn't used to such openness from figures of authority, especially someone in the justice system. Her first instinct was to dismiss the letter, chalking it up to a moment of guilt or politeness. But as she thought about it, she realized that there was an opportunity here. An opportunity not just for reconciliation, but for something deeper. She had spent years working within systems, fighting for changes that were often met with resistance. Maybe this was a chance to engage with someone who was willing to listen, to understand the work she was doing, and perhaps change the way he saw the people who came before him in court. After a few moments of thought, Tasha decided to respond. She agreed to meet with him, not because she owed him anything, but because there was a chance, just a chance, that their conversation could be something meaningful. She set a time and place, and with that, the seeds of a new kind of dialogue were sown. It would be a conversation about more than just a fine. It would be about understanding, growth, and the kind of justice that goes beyond the courtroom. As she sealed the letter, Tasha felt a sense of quiet optimism. This was uncharted territory for both of them, but perhaps it would be the start of something important. For the first time in a while, she was eager to see where this unexpected connection might lead. Tasha walked into the small cafe with a sense of anticipation, though she kept her usual calm demeanor. She wasn't sure what to expect from her meeting with Judge Harris. Part of her still couldn't believe he had taken the time to reach out, but another part of her, one that had been fighting for change for so long, sensed that this was an opportunity for something more. This wasn't just a chance to clear up a misunderstanding about a traffic violation. It was a moment to bridge two worlds that often seemed disconnected: the courtroom and the military. The cafe was quiet, with the hum of conversation blending into the soft jazz playing in the background. Tasha spotted the judge immediately. He was sitting at a corner table, looking every bit the part of a man who was used to control and authority, his posture straight and his suit crisp. But there was a softness in his eyes now, a curiosity that hadn't been there when he'd sat behind his bench in the courtroom. Sergeant Williams, he greeted her as she approached, standing up with a respectful nod. "I'm glad you could meet with me." Tasha offered a polite smile and sat down across from him. "Thank you for reaching out, Judge Harris. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation." The judge nodded, his hands clasped in front of him as he studied her. "I have to admit, I made a mistake," he said, diving into the heart of the matter. "When you were in my courtroom, I didn't know who you were or the work you've been doing. I just followed the law. But now that I've learned more about you, I realize how little I understood. I want to understand more, not just about your work, but about who you are, and how we can make sure that the law takes all of us into account, not just the letter of the law." Tasha listened intently, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She had expected a more formal exchange, perhaps a few words of apology, and then a polite goodbye. But this was different. He wasn't just acknowledging his mistake. He was asking for a deeper understanding. It wasn't every day that someone in a position of authority took responsibility and sought to learn. "I appreciate that," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "The work I do in the military isn't about the accolades or the recognition. It's about ensuring that everyone who serves, regardless of background or identity, has a chance to succeed. For me, it's personal. I've seen too many talented individuals overlooked or discouraged simply because they didn't fit a certain mold. My goal is to help change that." Judge Harris leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "How do you do that?" he asked. "How do you break through the structures that have been in place for so long?" Tasha paused, considering how to explain it in a way that resonated with someone who had spent his career in the justice system. "It's about creating a culture of inclusion, of making sure that the systems we work in are shaped by the people within them, not just by outdated norms. It's about recognizing the value of diversity and not just checking boxes. We have to shift the narrative, change the way people think about who belongs and why." For the next hour, they talked about the challenges in the military, about the biases that had shaped both of their careers, and about the ways institutions could either uplift or stifle individuals based on their backgrounds. Tasha shared stories of soldiers she had mentored, of leaders who had once been dismissed, but later proved to be some of the most capable individuals she had ever worked with. Judge Harris shared his own struggles with understanding how systemic issues played out in courtrooms, and how often he found himself confronted with biases he hadn't fully recognized in his own decisions. By the end of the meeting, there was a quiet shift in both of them. Judge Harris no longer saw Tasha as just another defendant, and Tasha saw in the judge a man who was willing to grow. It wasn't a perfect conversation, nor did they agree on everything, but there was an understanding between them, an understanding that was about more than just the law or the military. It was about people, their stories, and the shared responsibility they both had to make the world more just. As they shook hands and parted ways, Tasha felt a new sense of purpose. The conversation had been far more than she had expected, and she left with the realization that even those who seemed the most distant from her world could be allies in the fight for change. She didn't know what the future held, but she was certain that this unexpected meeting had opened a door, and for the first time in a long while, she was hopeful about the possibility of new allies. People like Judge Harris, who were willing to step outside their comfort zones to create something better. In the weeks following her meeting with Judge Harris, Sergeant Tasha Williams couldn't help but reflect on their conversation. It had been a turning point, not just for her, but for both of them. The judge, a figure of authority in a system she had often found to be rigid and unforgiving, had shown a willingness to listen and understand. It was something rare, something that had given Tasha a renewed sense of optimism. Judge Harris, for his part, had made a concerted effort to dive deeper into the world Tasha had introduced him to. He had spent hours reading reports on the military's diversity initiatives, speaking with former colleagues and experts in the field, and even attending a few briefings on racial equity in the armed forces. He had been surprised at how little he had known about the complexities of military life beyond the headlines. Tasha's work, he now realized, was about far more than ticking boxes. It was about reshaping the way people thought about leadership, opportunity, and inclusion. One afternoon, he found himself sitting in his chambers, reviewing a case involving a young black man accused of a minor offense. Normally, Harris would have delivered a straightforward ruling, applying the law as he always did. But now, after everything he had learned from Tasha, his perspective had shifted. He looked at the case through a different lens, not just as a judge, but as someone who understood the nuances of how background and circumstance shaped behavior. With a thoughtful sigh, he made his decision, offering the defendant a second chance, a reminder that the law could be as compassionate as it was firm. It wasn't a radical departure from the way he had always worked, but it was a small shift, one that reflected the growing awareness he had developed about fairness, opportunity, and empathy. As for Tasha, her work continued to gain traction. The diversity and inclusion initiatives she had pioneered were having a lasting impact, with more and more soldiers advancing through the ranks, their potential no longer confined by outdated biases. She was invited to speak at military conferences, her voice gaining recognition as a leader in the charge for equality within the armed forces. The presentation she had been preparing before the courtroom incident was now a key part of her ongoing work, and it had become a symbol of the broader changes she was working to create. But it wasn't just the public recognition that mattered to Tasha. It was the conversations that were happening behind closed doors, in the offices of senior leaders who were beginning to understand the importance of her work. Even those who had once dismissed her efforts were now coming to her for advice, seeking to align their units with her vision of an inclusive military. One afternoon, months after their first meeting, Tasha received an unexpected invitation. It was from Judge Harris. He had been invited to speak at a legal conference on justice and reform, and he had requested that Tasha join him as a guest speaker to share her experience in advocating for change in the military. Tasha smiled as she read the letter. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. In the time since their meeting, they had forged an unlikely yet meaningful connection. Judge Harris had become an ally, someone who understood the intersection of law, justice, and social change, and was eager to learn more. The relationship between them was no longer defined by a courtroom judgment. It was built on mutual respect, a shared commitment to fairness, and a willingness to evolve. As Tasha prepared for her speech, she thought about how far she had come, not just in her career, but in her understanding of how change happens. It wasn't always quick, and it wasn't always easy, but moments like the one with Judge Harris proved that even the smallest conversations could spark something larger. The journey was far from over, but Tasha felt ready for whatever came next. Together, she and Judge Harris were proof that progress didn't always happen in grand, sweeping gestures. Sometimes, it was the quiet conversations, the willingness to listen and learn, that made all the difference. And for Tasha, that was the beginning of a new chapter, one where change was not just possible, but already unfolding.